Welcome, everyone, to Red Planet Live. I am your host, Ashton Zeth. I am elated to be hosting the Mars Society's podcast and leading the conversation about human exploration of the universe and the future settlement of Mars. As a longtime space enthusiast, I am passionate about STEM education and making humanity an interplanetary species. Thank you, everybody, for joining today and supporting Red Planet Live. Well, like always, going to kick off today's conversation with just a couple quick Mars Society announcements. The first is that the Mars Technology Institute recently launched the Mars Against Hunger Prize, which is a global competition to develop innovative food production technologies for sustaining human life on Mars. With traditional greenhouse methods proving inefficient for large-scale settlements, MTI seeks alternative biotechnologies such as methane-based protein production. These advancements could not only support future Mars missions, but also help combat hunger on Earth. Innovators worldwide are invited to participate by submitting a preliminary report by June 30th, 2025. For more information, you can go to this link right here or go to marssociety.org. All right. And secondly, if you are enjoying this podcast, please take a moment to rate us on Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcasts. Your support does help us reach more space enthusiasts like yourself and bring you better content. So we sincerely appreciate the support. Okay, so for today's conversation, I am particularly excited about this one. Over the years, I have read various books and articles and watched movies and, as a space enthusiast normally does, about the space industry, and this person's name has come up many, many times. It is wonderful today to be meeting with Jim Cantrell. Jim is a pioneering aerospace engineer, entrepreneur, and investor with a career spanning over 4 decades. Jim was a founding team member of SpaceX, where he served as its first VP of Business Development and later founded StratSpace, Vector Launch, and most recently, Phantom Space. With experience at NASA JPL and the French Space Agency, Jim has worked on over 46 satellite missions, including Iridium NEXT, LightSail, and OSIRIS-REx. He has been a key innovator in software-defined satellites, micro-launch vehicles, and space situational awareness. And beyond aerospace, Jim is an avid road racer and founder of Vintage Exotic Competition Engineering, specializing in race car design and restoration. He has also held various executive roles and serves on multiple corporate and advisory boards, shaping the future of space and technology. Everybody welcome Jim Cantrell.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm so excited to be chatting with you. This is, if you follow me on Instagram, for those of you that do, you may have seen that I posted earlier today that this is a little bit of a full circle moment for me. When I was reading your book, Breaking All the Rules, right there, there was a line you mentioned about when you got that call, and it was from Elon Musk. And he said to you that he wanted to start a private space company, and he'd been recommended that he reach out to you by a mutual friend, Robert Zubrin. Obviously, Dr. Zubrin is the founder of the Mars Society, so it's so cool to get to read stuff like that and then get the opportunity to speak with you. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. I've go back to the early days of the Mars Society, so bit of a full circle for myself as well.
I love it. We're in the same boat there. But we're going to kick off today's conversation with a segment that I do every episode. It's called Question of the Day. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just meant to be an icebreaker, just to hear your opinion on something. And recently, I was at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida with my Thunderbird cohort. So it was really cool that I got to see, a bunch of the American space program history, and everybody always gets so excited, especially, those space enthusiasts. It's like nerd Disneyland for them, myself included. So that has inspired today's question, which is, if you could witness any historical moment in human history, what would it be? Now, I'll give you a second to think about it. Some examples could be like building of the pyramids, the Wright brothers' inaugural flight, the moon landing. What would that moment be for you if you could witness it?
Boy, that's a tough one, right? There's so many things about history that are fantastic. I guess one of the things that I, really am into is exploration. Like the Mars Society is about settling Mars, and I'm starting to think of going to Mars as sort of the equivalent of when our ancestors from Europe came to the New World and discovered it, for the Europeans at least. And I think it would be that moment when the Vikings landed in North America for the first time, somewhere around 1000 AD. That was
Hmm.
really the first Europeans that stepped foot here, and that's so symbolic to me, about the equivalent of going to Mars. And look, we made a settlement and a civilization here that went back and saved Europe from its own fascism, many hundreds of years later. So who knows where this all goes?
Yeah, that's a great answer and on the spot too. I love it. Let's see. Saying the moon landing seems like an obvious answer, especially after being at Kennedy Space Center. Um,
But
you,
I did see that on
you,
TV, right?
right,
I'm old enough.
right. So I would, my mind also went to 1776, like the founding of our country, to witness, the founding fathers signing the Declaration of Independence. I think that would be a pretty cool moment. I mean, maybe in that moment, they didn't know quite the impact that they were going to have in that moment. Wanting to be a sovereign nation. So I think that would be a pretty cool moment to go back and
Oh,
witness.
yeah, yeah, it would. Yeah.
And I'm sure we're going to have some responses in the chat too. So, those that are sure to put your moment that you want to witness in history.
Well, there's something for everybody in history, and
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons we like to study it. I've become fascinated with the Templars, the medieval knights that went
Yeah.
into the Middle East, and they were the ones that set up the original Western banking system to be able to fund the pilgrims as they came through the Middle East, and kind of like the early Swiss in a lot of ways. They eventually got chased out, of Jerusalem and the rest of the Middle East by the various Muslim tribes. But yeah, it was a hell of a moment in history, and about that, the better I think you can comprehend where the future might go. I think it's a really underrated study for most of us in the technical fields.
Hmm. We're going to have a question about this. I have a question about, history and how that impacts our future and maybe what lessons we can learn from that later in the conversation. So we'll keep
Okay,
that on the back. But I want to
hold you to
remind everybody, those that are listening, if you have questions for Jim, please put those in the chat. I will try to sprinkle those in throughout the conversation. But I want to dive right in. I mean, I've got so many things I want to ask, and of course, we're not going to have enough time to get through all of those.
our
So
way.
let's just start at the beginning. For those that aren't familiar or haven't had a chance to read your book yet, just give us if you can, a quick summary of like, how did you get into space? What was your educational background like that led you to where you are now?
Yeah, so maybe it's typical, maybe it's not. I don't really know, but I grew up poor on a chicken ranch in Southern California to a family that generations after generations never got anything past its high school equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
And so I never really had an expectation of going to college, or let alone getting in the space industry. But my mother, bless her heart, and I don't mean that in the way they say it in Texas. She made sure I went to university, and it was a struggle. She and I struggled over it, mainly me telling her no.
Mm-hmm.
And once I did, I started out in electrical engineering, almost failed. I ended up going over to mechanical because only thing I ever knew for sure in my life I wanted to do was to race cars. And so mechanical engineering had a certain appeal related to that. And with the idea that I would eventually go to Detroit to work for one of the auto industry giants, I ended up finding a poster in the hallway at Utah State University, which said, "Come help us design a rover for Mars." And it was a NASA-funded design course, mechanical engineering, 595, and it was taught by a guy, retired Colonel Frank Red. And so I went up and I applied for the course. It took a lot of gumption. At that point in my life, I was a lot more introverted than I am today. And to go out and face this guy who was a retired colonel and tell him I thought I was worthy of his course took a lot of well, I'm not going to use the word. So he accepted me in, and I did really well. We went to Washington to compete against all the other schools, MIT, Caltech, small schools.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are from Utah State University out in the hayseed fields. And so we won. We got first place out of all this. And part of the prize of that was we got to send two of our best students to JPL, and so I was one of them. And when I went to JPL, I ended up working for a guy named Jim Burke, who was the Ranger program. That's the first American lunar program. He was their program manager back in the day, and Jim was this Renaissance man, and he just recently passed away. But Jim smiled at the world and had bright ideas and always had enthusiasm and a very independent way of approaching the problem. And so he and I really worked well together. But there was another crazy guy named Lou Friedman who started the Planetary Society, and he and Carl Sagan and Bruce Murray. And Lou was fired from JPL for parking his motorcycle on the flower beds, and he refused to do otherwise, and so they got rid of him. So he went and started the Planetary Society. So he was working with the French and the Soviets on just trying to get the U.S. together with them to do more in space. This was in the mid '80s when there were still the Soviet communists out there, and we were locked in what we thought was a deadly Cold War that would end poorly, with all of us being vaporized by nuclear weapons. So this was kind of interesting to me. So that's how I got into the space industry and ended up working for the French in 1989. So the rest is kind of history.
Yeah, it's a great story, and yeah, if you haven't had a chance to read it, check out Jim's book. It's great. I learned a lot, and there's a few moments where I literally laughed out loud. But one of the things that really intrigued me was the story about when you were at JPL and the snake. You're using a snake mechanism with the Mars balloon design. For those that are unfamiliar, can you talk us through what that prototype was? What was it? And trying to imagine what it
Sure.
looked.
So there was a guy named Gentry Lee at the time. He was the JPL detailee to NASA headquarters. He later was an author with Arthur C. Clarke. But Gentry Lee had some money he had given us to study Mars balloons, and there was no official Mars balloon mission on the American side. There was on the French side, and it was part of the Soviet mission to Mars, which the French back then were cooperating with the Soviets since the 60s. So, we were just, farting around, as we called it, with Mars balloons and how we would fly them. And so one idea we had was a balloon that would, during the day, would heat up and rise above the surface, and the winds would blow it from place to place. And then at night, as the sun went down, the balloon would come down, and it would deposit something on the surface to offset that lost buoyancy. And so the original idea that the Soviets had was what I termed a Samsonite suitcase. So that you can imagine something rugged like a Samsonite that they would put on the ground, and the balloon, of course, there were surface winds, and sometimes very significant, would blow this Samsonite suitcase across the surface. That's all great and fine until you run into a crevice or a hole or something, and it drops right into it. So Jim and I set about the task of trying to solve that problem of how could we design something that could offload the balloon, because that was a necessary engineering function, yet not create a lot of shock up the rope to the what amounted to be a very fragile balloon. It was 3.5 micron mylar in a very cold temperature, and do it in such a way it wouldn't get stuck. So Jim and I, in his ramshackle office, he was not a guy that was tidy, so he had all these things. I mean, he must have had so many historic things in his office that I'd sit on piles of paper, I'm sure, that were historic. But we got a bunch of these styrofoam coffee cups, and we taped them together, and we used the snake's biology of these overlapping scales as sort of the whole idea of how do snakes do it. And as we began to play with it, we understood that there was sort of an inherent flexibility you needed to take out the surface roughness, but yet at some point a stiffness so it wouldn't fall in the hole. And so, the so-called integrating over surface features is what we invented. And so he and I applied for a patent through NASA and got it. And we went and built a prototype. I did that in my garage at home on one of my visits back to Utah, and took some of the sheet metal I was using for a race car and wrapped it together in a cone and riveted it together and put chains in it. And it was nice because it collapsed into a nice small size. It was about 10 meters long, but I collapsed it so it could fit in the trunk of my car. And then we took it out in the Mojave Desert on a real lava field under a helium balloon. And it was unbelievable. We couldn't believe how well it went over the lava. It didn't get stuck. In fact, we couldn't catch it. So that became the snake, which became an official part of the Soviet-French mission to Mars.
So cool. And when I was reading about that experience, I was wondering, in your career, at any other point, have you been able to replicate a design that you found in nature and related that to something that you were building for space?
Well, I mean, I think all good mechanical design or industrial design does that, right? Nature has this optimization to it. There are
Mhm.
some codes you can buy, and the stuff doesn't necessarily look very good, that will, optimize your design based on, certain criteria. So yeah, I would say, everything we do has to look good, for me, right? I look at a design and that's ugly. It's not right. And so I'm constantly doing that, like with my car business,
Mhm.
when I have to build a car from the ground up, which I've done several times, something might look good on paper and you look at it in reality, you go, that's not going to work, so that's really emulating nature. But, except for like one of the Gossamer aircraft I worked on with Jim Burke, don't really go to look at animals necessarily how they're designed. A lot of people do for like robotics. There's a lot of interesting things you can learn from the way animals move that can be replicated in robots, and some conservation of center of gravity, things of that nature is very, very interesting. Yeah, so I would say that's really true for all of us, and with rockets, it's another thing. It's like, well, it's got to look good to fly, and
Mhm.
as they say about aircraft. Yeah,
There's always got to be a little bit of like an aesthetic element to it. It has to.
absolutely. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned, your car business. So you're an avid car racer designer. Like, where did that love come from?
I don't know. I was born with it. Some of the earliest pictures I have of me when I'm, like 3 years old, I wouldn't allow people to take pictures of me unless I had a car in front of me. And then, there's later pictures of me in those little pedal cars. And then I got my first go-kart when I was, I think about 7 or 8 years old. And somebody in the neighborhood, their son had abandoned it in front of the house. And so I knocked on the door. And again, it was one of those things that took great courage. And
Hmm.
my reward was I got a go-kart. So yeah, it's been, it's the thing that kept me sane, kept me off drugs, kept me, away from, all the bad things that kids do. And, it was my motivation. And in fact, I paid my way through college because we really couldn't afford, the tuition. So I worked as a Ford mechanic all the way through college. And frankly, I learned to be a better engineer because of it. I'll probably learn more doing that than I did in the university about, real design.
Hmm. I was wondering when I was reading about your time working in the auto body shop and the go kart that you were just referencing. I know I'm a sucker for a collectible. Like if it's something cool, space related, I want to keep it. You can kind of see I've got some of those things.
Right.
Those original go karts that you had. I wonder, have you got them in storage somewhere in a garage?
No, no, I gave them to my
On.
nephews, who, are Gen Xers, back to our earlier conversation about generations. And they just, they didn't love it as much as I did. In fact, it's ironic. I have 6 children, and the two in my family that love cars are racers are girls. And
Mhm.
one of them happens to be an auto mechanic. So yeah, I gave those away. Maybe I should have kept them, but I had such a chaotic life ever since then. I don't know what would have happened to them.
Mhm. Well, speaking of the chaos and the life since then, would love to hear a little bit about, your current business, Phantom Space.
Sure.
For those that don't know, what is it? What's its purpose? Maybe your vision. What are you trying to build with Phantom Space?
Yeah, sure. Well, we think of Phantom Space as being the Henry Ford of space. And if you go back 100 years to Henry Ford, he and his company made terrestrial transportation available to the common person. Before Henry Ford mass produced cars, they would cost in then year dollars, $8,000, $9,000. And they
Hmm.
were really just the toys of the rich people. And, they would have to have special drivers and so on. But, when Henry Ford got the price down to $600, $700, then even his employees could afford it. So we want to do the same thing with space by making it digital. And if you look at the way the e-commerce is today, if you want an e-commerce site, you can go to a number of different places. Squarespace is my favorite. And, I don't have to know HTML like I used to. And, 20 years ago, I was programming HTML for websites. Now I just go drag some images around, pop this in, and I've got it. That's where space has to get to bring in the other 3 billion people in the world. And there's a couple of reasons why you really have to do this. First, getting to and from space, physically is going to be limited, despite what everybody thinks about, Starship and how marvelous it is. It's still a very limited quantity. If for no other reason, there's very limited number of launch sites, launch ranges, and capacity out of those ranges. So it's a little bit like airports, right? So there's just not an unlimited amount you can do there. More importantly, the volume in low Earth orbit, for example, really is between 300 kilometers and 1,000. Above 1,000, it's radiation. Below 300, too much atmosphere. So it's a finite volume. So we can only fly so many satellites there without running into bigger and bigger problem of collisions. It's not a problem tomorrow, but it's a problem eventually. And then getting the data back. So that's also limited by spectrum, RF spectrum. So it's an inherently limited quantity of things that keep this space to a limited number of satellites, despite our massively growing numbers. We're going to, in order to get space to the other 3 billion people, we're going to have to make that digital. We're going to have to make it such that you don't have to build a satellite, go to somebody like us and launch it to have a space activity, to have a space app, if you will. So that's our phantom cloud. Think of it as micro data servers in space that also routes all the data from the satellites, the third-party satellites, through our servers, so that you can apply artificial intelligence to it. So to support that, we're building a launch vehicle and we build the satellites. And so you might say, well, why do you need all of that? Well, all you have to do is look at SpaceX. And this was, I can tell you, because I was there in the early days, this was part of our idea. You own the launch, you own the satellites, you can do whatever you want. And you can do it at half the cost and 10 times the speed. And that's exactly what SpaceX has done. So we have what we call our Daytona launch vehicle, it puts about 650 kilos into a sun synchronous orbit. I wouldn't call it a micro, it's more of a medium-sized launch vehicle. And we think it's right size for the market. We have a lot of contracts already for it. We're about 18 months away from our first launch. So that's our foundation. It gives us a foundation of revenue. It gives us a foundation of getting to space. Those two things are very important. Same with the satellites. We already built a satellite, delivered it to a customer. We've got a number of other satellite contracts on the way. And then we'll build our own constellation with those satellites. So that's what we're up to. We've been in business 5 years. One of my co-founders is Chris Thompson. He was employee number 2 at SpaceX. He was in charge of the Falcon 1, 9, and the Dragon capsule. So to say he's experienced is an understatement. And I've got 2 other early SpaceX guys on the team. So we kind of put the band back together, and we mixed it in with some young talent that I've gathered up along the way on Light Sail and some other programs. So we're very quiet. We don't put a lot of things out on social media because this is an era where you see a lot of people with PowerPoints and no hardware. We want to be a lot of hardware, no PowerPoint. Yeah. So that's why we don't, show things, because frankly, nobody needs to know until we get a rocket on the pad, and then people say, Phantom, who's that? So that's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, you want that moment when they're like, oh, who's this guy? Just pass all expectations. We've got a couple, I know some students from my program, Thunderbird, that are listening, and we are interested in the space ecosystem from like a commercial or private sector lens. When we talk a lot about the space ecosystem, the space economy, and there's a couple of us that have a little bit of like an entrepreneurial spirit in there as well. My parents were small business owners as well, and so we're always trying to look at it through that lens. What advice would you give to maybe young aspiring entrepreneurs that are looking to make an impact in the commercial space sector?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of advice I can give you. I've had, a lot of startups. I'm on my 11th one. 2 just bombed completely. I think I I learn the most from those, frankly.
Hmm.
It's really true what people say about failure. A couple of things, just in general outside the space industry, you really have to do something you're passionate about, and you have to be good at it, and people have to want to buy it. So, in other words, it creates value
Right.
that can make that money flow. Because without no bucks, no Buck Rogers. You've heard that, but
Yeah.
it's really true. It starts with passion, and it ends with doing something people want to buy. So I know a lot of people who have two out of the three. And
Hmm.
I think if you think about it, you can identify some people in your worlds that are the same way. But in the end, like in space, there's an article in Forbes that came out today that I gave an interview. They called me the accidental leader, and it's probably true. But one of the things I said was, find a problem that you want to solve and go solve it. Don't ask permission, just go do it. And again, I'd apply the first three rules to that problem, but that's how you get it done here. And all the great people in the world that have made great contributions to humanity have done just that. They've decided this is a problem that needs to be solved. It's a world class problem. I'm going to do it. Did I lose you guys? I guess Ashton's feed dropped. So yeah, I can talk a little bit about that until Ashton gets back. I mean, if you look at SpaceX, I remember the early days, when Elon said, "Hey, let's do this." Um, he said, "Look, we have to solve the problem of getting to space. It's just too expensive," and that's why we're over in Russia screwing around looking for Russian rockets, because they were essentially surplused out ICBMs, and we headed over there to try to make a deal for this, rather smaller Mars mission compared to what he's planning now. But the first problem, Elon says, is we have to solve launch, and that's why we started with the Falcon 1. And the Falcon 1 was always in Elon's mind a practice vehicle. The rest of us thought differently. Chris Thompson and I both thought, gee, if we mass manufacture the Falcon 1, we can get the price down. And we have models that we believe that that's an even stronger reduction in price than is large reusable. They're both very competitive ways to do it. But if you want to go to Mars, you have to have large vehicles. So that's why reusability becomes the thing. So that was the second part of the problem. And I can tell you from the very beginning, reusability was part of the problem stack. So that's how Elon's mind works, right? And if you look at, Edison, Einstein, all these great minds, they all pick a problem to solve, and that they go solve it, right? So that's how that's how we do that. So I think what I'm going to do, since Ashton's not back, I'm gonna go over into the questions. I see one from Bobby Thompson. And it says, are there any international regulations that restrict the type and amount of payloads by a private carrier? The answer is yes. So, you can't put nuclear warheads in space. I know that seems ludicrous, but there's actually a treaty about that for good reason, as it turns out. But more importantly, the regulatory regime, at least for the U.S., has changed over the years. It used to be you could not launch satellites with resolution, even approaching a meter, sort of ground sampling distance. And over time, that's come down to about 0.6 of a meter. There we go. She came back. So there are also other regulations up there. Launching nuclear power plants is currently, practically speaking, not allowed. Every time you go through a process of getting your satellite approved, they'll ask you two things. What radio emissions do you make? What kind of cameras do you have on? Even if we have star cameras, which we just use for looking at the stars and determining which way we're pointing, becomes an issue, because there are things up there people don't want you to see, right? There's classified things, and so there's keep out zones, as it turns out. So you enter into this, at least if you're a U.S. Satellite operator, you enter into this really weird world where those sort of things happen. So, welcome back.
Thank you. I can honestly say that has never happened before. I'm not sure what happened there, but we're here.
Well, we just kept talking and answering questions. So the
Excellent.
floor is yours now.
There we go. Well, hey, thanks for your patience. Again, not sure what happened there, but let's see. Earlier I had mentioned the little snippet in your book about when Elon Musk called you. Tell us a little bit about like what those early days at SpaceX were like.
Yeah. So early days at SpaceX were weird. It was, you
In a,
know, go ahead.
I said in a good way.
Oh yeah, yeah. There weren't always good moments, I'll be honest, but
Sure.
it was a typical startup. Like I told you earlier, I've been through 11 startups, and this one was no different. We were being led by a guy who was really experienced at it, which seems kind of funny now, right? Looking back on it, and everything is sparse. When you're one of the first 10 or less, you get to do everything. I shouldn't say get to, you have to do everything.
Right.
So I remember one day sitting, this was on Grand Avenue in El Segundo, the old first plant we had. And it was a crappy building, but it was, is what we had.
Mhm.
And the network wasn't working and I couldn't get internet. And I remember, just getting frustrated with trying to get the network to work. And this guy named Brandon Sykes, who was the VP of IT for PayPal, he was our guy. So I called Brandon, this, that, and the other. And I remember looking out on the floor where we would be building rockets, and Elon was too cheap to paint the floor. It was like a bare concrete floor with a lot of rubber marks on it. And we're
Mhm.
all like, "Hey, Elon, we need to really paint the floor." And we got a bid for it, $60,000 back then, and I thought Elon was going to have a heart attack, right over $60,000. And there's insulation falling. Of course, he parks his McLaren, his $1 million McLaren in there. And so that moment just is always stuck in my head. And I went out and took a picture of his McLaren sitting there, and I just thought, this isn't going to work. you know. And then there were other moments where, Elon was a very demanding, I should say, a very demanding person. And I'm watching this whole Doge thing, and I think I can smell it from here, because I'm having flashbacks, to the 3 a.m. phone calls, where are you? Well, I'm in bed. What are you doing? I'm sleeping like most people. Well,
Mhm.
I'm at work and you need to be here, clank.
Yeah.
And so that was like, well, at one time I was in Utah at my home. So I found a flight, was down there by about 9 o'clock, but he was none too happy that it took me that long to get 1,000 miles to work, right? But he would not take no for an answer. And I think that's, there's two things that define Elon that I think makes him different. And this is, if you look at Doge, like it or not, right? I'm not even going to get into that conversation. But like it or not, the man does not conceive of failure. He
Mhm.
took this on, and in his mind, he's going to succeed absolutely, and he will do everything in his power to make it succeed, and he will co-opt anybody and everybody to make it succeed. That's why when people ask me, "What do you think they'll really make it to Mars?" I say, "Absolutely."
Mhm.
This was the idea. I can tell you, in those early days, it was an act of insanity to say in 2001 that we're going to build a launch vehicle ourselves. Nobody had done that privately ever. To
Mhm.
that point in time, only nation states could do that. They're the
Right.
only ones that had the capital, of the financial capital and the human capital to make it happen. And so at that same time, Elon would come to me and say, "Hey, look at this." And he'd pull out this drawing of a Mars base. And, it was a facepalm moment for me.
Yeah.
I'm like, Elon, look, we're bad enough talking about making rockets. People think we're insane. You talk about this is kind of like talking about aliens visiting me last night,
Mhm.
but he was thinking about that from the early days. And I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that he considers this a mission that if he fails, he will have failed in life. So he will do everything in his power to make it happen. I think he'll make it happen, right?
Yeah.
And so that whole startup, I have to tell you, when he called me and we got together and we went to Russia, it just seemed like another guy with a lot of money that wanted to do something. It wouldn't go very far. And in my book, I compare it to people that, got rich guys that come to the racetrack and they
Hmm.
watch the cars go around. They're like, oh, this sounds great. And then they say, oh, I want to learn how to race. And they get in the car and then they figure out it's hot, it's miserable, it's hard work. You get sore. You have to love it. You have to absolutely love it. And
Hmm.
most of these wealthy entrepreneurs that made their money on software get into the aerospace industry. And it's just like racing. It's hard. It's gritty. We're nasty people. Like we're all a little clique, and we can see these guys coming from a mile away. And that's what I thought Elon was. I was wrong. I was way, way wrong, and never imagined he had this kind of gumption. Most people don't know, the fourth rocket on the goal line that finally worked. They were down to $180,000 in the bank. They were almost done. And unless you really dug into some of the books about SpaceX, you wouldn't necessarily know that, right? So looking back on it, I've learned more sort of in retrospect than I did at the time. I left early because I didn't think it would work, and I said, well, I got all these guys want me to do a bunch of classified space stuff, and that sounds fun, so I went and did that.
Yeah, gonna go work on those things. Well, with he does have a tenacity, like you said. He's gonna get there, and you have to appreciate that. He's not willing to fail. He will literally do anything and everything, and spend all of his money to try to make it happen. And so, with the changing of the tides right now, we're seeing this new momentum with, for example, like Jared Isaacman being selected, or nominated for leading NASA. Like, I think there's this new wave of enthusiasm and excitement and focus specifically on Mars. So it's exciting time. We might be, witnessing the next major moment in history when humanity makes it to Mars. So I'm excited about the future, and that was going to be a question for you: is what are you most excited about right now? You're on the forefront and the cutting edge of the space industry. What are you excited about?
I'm excited about so many things. I don't think we have time to talk about them all,
So
but
list them all.
I want to go back to what you just said. And I want to frame this time we're living in here. I think it's probably one of the most historic times of all of humanity. So you start off by asking me a great question. What would you want to see? The next thing I was going to ask you, in the future or what? I want to see humans land on Mars. I don't want to go. I didn't want to be part of it, but it is so important to the future of humanity. I never thought that it was ever possible in my lifetime. I knew it was possible eventually.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think we're seeing something as momentous as the Vikings landing on North America, and then Christopher Columbus another 400 years later. It truly is. And then once the first human being is born off this planet, that will be the most human ever, right? You think of it from a species point of view. And Elon likes to use this term species, which I think is kind of funny. And he says, of course I'm a speciesist, right? And we all are, actually, or at least we ought to be. But that, as a speciesist, is the most important thing we can ever imagine, right? Our DNA has reached out into the cosmos and has took its first step, right? I mean, we arguably did it on the moon, but we retreated from it. And here's what we're talking about: is going out there. And imagine a future in 500 years. So go back 500 years here in the Western world.
Mm-hmm.
And when, the Spanish galleons were first coming here and they're bringing gold back. And if you were standing on the shores of Spain, could you imagine what the new world would be where we are sitting today, what it would become? There's no way, right? Try that thought exercise about what Mars will look like in 500 years. And maybe there's a future on Mars where, I know this is a little sci-fi, but future on Mars where there's whole industries there, that there's gigantic cities, that they've terraformed parts of Mars, that it becomes a livable second home to humanity, that then is on its way figuring out how to actually go to the stars, which is the thing that fascinates me the most, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these things all thrill me to death. I'm also
Yeah.
very thrilled to death about digitizing space. That's why I'm still in this. I'm 60 years old, and I should be playing with my grandchildren and racing my cars more and spending time, looking at the lake in Utah where I have a house. But I'm driven. I'm driven by doing that digital transformation. I think it needs to be done. So I kind of understand Elon in a way. I don't have nearly the drive he has, but boy, it just still keeps me awake at night.
Yeah. Well, most people, I'm not sure if there anybody is that has quite the same drive, but I hear you there. Having the drive and that, this is a fundamental humanity, saving potentially effort. And you hear about astronauts that go to space or they're at the ISS and they get the overview effect where they're looking back at Earth and they don't see those borders, they don't see different races or ethnicities or languages, like they just see one unified humanity. And I think that's part of why this is so important for humans to get to Mars. Right now there's a lot of negativity in the world and fighting and there's just all these things that make it feel like, hey, we're more divided. But I think once that first human makes it to Mars, we're going to become a lot more unified, and I'm
Yeah.
hoping to see that moment. So
So
however,
here's my peacenik offering to you guys, right?
yeah.
I'm a Latter-day Peacenik. Think of all the money and the treasure and the blood that's been spilled in wars and hell, the years I've been alive. And if
Mhm.
we use that to settle Mars, if we use that to go out somewhere else, how much better off would we be as a species? It's just immense, right? I just get sickened by all these wars and
Mhm.
just the pure waste of human effort that it took to build these cities and to maintain them. And if you're a parent like me, you think about all the children that are killed in that. And I don't mean small children, but
Yeah.
every one of us is somebody's child, right? And
Mhm.
the heartbreak, and it's just terrible. So yeah, it's a very aspirational and inspirational goal to go to Mars and to plant a flag, if you will, there that humans are here, and
Mhm.
I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, same. Very excited, and we are naturally trying to save ourselves. It's that fight or flight response. There's a lot of reasons for us to go to Mars, but we're natural explorers. We're curious, but in the far off chance that there's another asteroid that comes to Earth, like we want to be able to save humanity. And I think that's a driver as well, that no matter what happens, by having humans on another planet, we will at some level save the species. And I think that there's something inherent in all of us about wanting to save ourselves, save people. So just another reason for us to make it to that next planet, and that's very exciting. In your mind, what are some of the like technological things, innovations that we still need to potentially create or refine for us to get to Mars? Obviously, we need to make it feasible economically, like there's the launch cost. But what else do we need to accomplish before we get humans to Mars?
Yeah, chemical propulsion is pretty good. It's good enough in the size that starships coming together with to go to Mars. To get beyond Mars, it's really not good enough.
Mhm.
So the problem is physics is a very stubborn thing, and we just don't have anything. It's not really a matter of, like solving AIDS or any of these sort of things, or the Manhattan Project for that matter, of going out and inventing something that's better. There's almost this evolutionary path that we have to have. Again, I would argue all the resources we poured into war would be better spent on this, but we really
Mhm.
need propulsion. Somebody I saw in the questions was asking about nuclear propulsion, and yeah, there's just this stigma, unfortunately, that our news media, since I was a kid, has made us all afraid of nuclear energy. I'm here in Arizona, and we have the U.S.'s biggest nuclear power plant. And do I lose any sleep over it? Hell no. Guess who buys most of it? California. So they don't want them, but we'll have them here. And eventually, nuclear propulsion is part of the answer. Maybe it
Mhm.
becomes the answer once we advance, fusion and things like that. So I'm actually pleased to see that we have a new renewed interest in nuclear, particularly in space.
Mhm. Of
No, nobody wants that stuff falling in their backyard, of course, but
course.
the Soviets did that in 1979, dropped a nuclear powered radar satellite in Canada. Yeah. So there are real dangers there that it's like anything else, like flying planes. You just have to evolve the engineering.
Hmm. Yeah. Speaking of, the Soviets and Russia, I was going to ask, you talked a lot about your experience working with those Russian engineers around the fall of the Soviet Union. Given today's geopolitical climate, do you think that the U.S. government and the commercial space sector should pursue similar international partnerships to accelerate space exploration and eventual future settlement of Mars? Like, do we need to have more collaboration? Because right now there's obviously some tensions, specifically, the U.S. and China, for example.
So my opinion is not very popular, but I'm going to say it anyhow. Capitalism has brought more good to the world than probably any other single thing. And capitalism is primarily us using our resources and our money and our time in ways we think it's best. So, to forfeit that to governments and expect them to do the right thing is, at one point in time, probably necessary when, our liberty, our very liberty was threatened by regimes in Europe and Asia. But today is not that as much. I know China's a big threat to us in ways, but if to use your earlier analogy, if the race was to go to Mars, would the Chinese really put all their effort into, trying to sabotage what we're doing here and take Taiwan back, or would they want to take more of Mars? Or would they want to take more of the moon? Right?
Mhm.
Maybe that's a healthier competitiveness, and capitalism really is competitiveness. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't see the Russians in the same light that a lot of people do. I mean, clearly they're, as a culture, very capable of a lot of shenanigans. So are we, by the way, and so is China.
Right.
We, as the lawyers will tell you, we don't have clean hands. Um, on and on. I won't go into my theories on that, but we'd be better off letting commercial do it, because money doesn't lie, and there's nothing wrong with people making money and making a lot of money doing it. That's a reward for an incentive for doing these things. And if, like Elon, you look at him, and
Mhm.
I tell people, and they think I'm crazy, but the man doesn't care about money. The money is only a resource to be conserved and used to achieve the bigger goal, right? And I'm kind of wired the same way. I have money. I don't have as much money as I could, I guess, if I focused on it. So I think these arguments about solving our problems here first before we go there are really disingenuous. And I think this idea of waiting for the Chinese to go arm in arm with us is probably not something that's going to work. Because people will figure out how to game it and take advantage of it, and the politicians will probably have their hands in all of our pockets from all sides, right? And that's my opinion.
Hmm. Well, hey, there's a lot to digest there, but I agree with you that capitalism, breeds innovation, efficiency. How do we work better? How do we create an improved product, and eventually, like, that's going to help us get to Mars. So I agree with you on that. I see we have a ton of audience questions, and I want to make
Yeah,
sure
I've
I
been
get.
watching.
Let's see. Maybe this is the last question that got submitted. What business suppliers do you wish there were more of as a rocket builder? Hmm.
Yeah, so the engines were kind of our Achilles heel. I decided early on that we didn't need to build engines if we could buy them from somebody, and we found a few suppliers. Ursa Major's one of them. Vast is another one. There's a few others we're working with. Be nice if there was a more robust supply network of that. If you look at even like the Henry Ford, the early days of Ford, they didn't build their own engines, and most people don't know that the Model T was designed by the Dodge brothers. So historically, that having suppliers of different things, particularly engines, is not necessarily a bad thing. Eventually, you want to bring those in, but I think this would promote a lot more diverse rocket supplier base, which I think we really need.
Yeah.
3 years ago, 4 years ago, when we were in the early days of Phantom, I saw a lot of quotes about, oh, there's 150 rocket companies and there'll be too many. And well, there was a lot of them that died all right, like predicted, and few have
Hmm.
survived on the other side. We're one of the few.
Hmm.
And surprisingly, most of the ones that died were either from inability to raise any money at all, or raising too much money and then spending it all.
Yeah.
And so the problem seems to be, having a good supply chain. And one of the reasons we survived is we didn't spend that money on rocket engines, and we focused on the things that we needed to build. Oddly enough, valves. We can't buy valves, so we got to be valve designers. And I remember it was during COVID when we found out it was going to take millions of dollars to get these valves. You know, as a mechanical engineer and a gearhead, I said, how hard can it be? So I went out and I found these valve design handbooks from the 80s, and I found some on eBay, and I sent them to all my engineers. And we had like a week-long session where we designed the main shutoff valve for our engines. And that's the valve we've qualified, and it's going to go, right? So you really have to have engines as the core of that. There's a lot of things you want to do yourself that aren't that capital intensive, but it's that capital intensity that I think has killed off most of these companies. And so when you have the need for that much capital, you also raise that much, and then it's funny how that happens. People's minds change, and they think, oh, we have $500 million in the bank. We're gonna look like we're Apple or whatever, and they spend like Apple, right? And it
Hmm.
just doesn't work, right? So that's the thing I've learned. Somebody asked earlier, what have you learned from your failures, or why didn't you give up, and how do you come back from failures? And the first thing I learned was, you don't spend any money in a startup, and this goes back to the SpaceX question, until you absolutely have to. Then you wait another month, and then by then most people figure out, oh, we didn't need that after all. There's a
Yeah.
lot of waste in how we do things.
Hmm.
And when I've had failures, I just won't give up, and I just have to keep coming back and back and back at it. And if you really truly believe that the problem you've chosen to solve is something that needs to happen, eventually the world comes to you. They sit and watch quietly, but they eventually say, yeah, maybe this guy's not so crazy after all.
Hmm. They come knocking saying, hey, we need something. Well, there's a question here, on the same line of thought about money. Terry Trevino, our friend Terry, can you tell us about your best means or methods of raising money?
Best way to raise money. Yeah, so it's all about the people, right? And I would say there's sort of two ways to look at it. So as the entrepreneur, how can I go out and raise money in the most efficient way? But you also need to think about, how can I go raise money from the right people?
Hmm.
And there's different flavors of money out there. And some of my failures have been, I think, from engaging the wrong flavor of money. In part, it's a self-inflicted wound exacerbated by that. But the best way to raise money in a startup is to have a great team, and a great team that all believes the same thing. I know this sounds like super simple, but people pick up on that, and investors, they invest because of the people, particularly in the early days, because somebody comes to you with an idea, and most of these investors have no idea how they can vet this, but they know people, right? And they look at the team, and they'll look at their experience, which is objective evidence, and they'll say, is this the right team to do this? And
Hmm.
and that is super, super important, which
Yeah.
is why solo founders are rarely successful. I'm not bagging on solo founders. I'm just saying their bar is much higher than having multiple founders. And all of us have imperfect personalities and behaviors and temperance and all that sort of thing. So when you have multiple founders, you tend to fill each other's holes,
Hmm.
and my strengths aren't his strengths, and so
Right.
forth. So behind that, you've got to have a great story, and
Hmm.
a great team and a great story is what raises money. And then the third thing is frugality, right? If you got the first two, but you're spending money like a drunken sailor, as we say, people are eventually going to stop putting money into you. So, yeah.
That totally resonates. I work in sales. I work in tech sales specifically, and that's a lesson that we've been taught, and I've learned. People buy people they like.
Yeah.
If you can develop a good relationship, and if you can demonstrate you as a person, people want to buy from you. So that totally makes sense. Let's see, another question here. This is from Bobby, who asks, "What do you think a realistic timeline to launch American astronauts to plant a flag on Mars? What do you think is a realistic timeline?"
So, yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb here. So, you guys all know probably that every 2 years is the optimum launch time. They call it the launch window.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got one coming up roughly in 2 years. I think there will probably be an unmanned launch by SpaceX then to
Okay.
Mars. And My guess is that's going to take 2 cycles before they get it right, maybe
Hmm.
3. So I would say humans to Mars in 8 years.
I love it. That is so optimistic. I'm sure everybody that's, listening is excited by that timeline. I would love to see it in 8 years. That would be incredible. Um, I got goosebumps. Think about it. 8 years from now, like where am I going to be 8 years from now watching humans on Mars?
And you all are a lot younger than me, so just imagine what you're going to see in your lifetime, right? I grew up watching men walk on the moon, and I thought that was a miracle.
Hmm. It's going to be, yeah, something that we never forget. I can't wait to witness the next monumental moment in humanity's history. Uh, it's going to be pretty great. Let's see. We've got a few more minutes. I'm not sure if this question got asked while I was dealing with technical issues. What lessons would you share for people building businesses and industries on Mars?
That's a really, I have to say, that's the first time I've ever heard that question. So I love it. Um, I would think about building infrastructure. So, I would use historical comparisons. I would think about, the first, it's more like the Europeans that first landed in the New World. Like there were people living here, obviously, but they had, grown up generations with skills and perspectives and preparation and things taught to them. The Europeans came here and had to learn from zero, right? And so assume that sort of same thing happens. We get to Mars, right? How are you initially going to survive? How are you going to survive through the winter, so to speak? Because there are seasons on Mars, right? How are you going to build on that survival, and
Mhm.
what sort of things are needed, right? That's going to be the first 50 years or so. So if you go back to history, 1492, Christopher Columbus lands here. There was the Roanoke colony, which was roughly 1589, and that colony died out. And then there was the Jamestown colony
Mhm.
in 1607, as I recall. And by the way, one of my great grandfathers was on the second resupply mission. They almost died, and just like Mars, there'll be resupply missions, right, for the first bit. And eventually, we're self-sustaining. And then what was it, like 1628? I think was Mayflower and that group. So there was 100 years almost before human settlement really settled in here. Where I live here in Tucson, the first Spaniards came through here in the late 1500s. So this part of the North America has actually been explored by the Europeans for a long time. But if you start looking at how that went down and the sort of things they needed, we don't have natives, I don't think, on Mars. So it's a little bit more like walking into the Sahara and how you're going to survive there.
Mhm.
I think I personally believe SpaceX will come with the bulldozers and tractors and cyber trucks. I see the boring machines boring holes in the side of mountains, and that's where we're going to live. And then the cyber trucks are going to drive around, and they're built to be pressurized. And that's why Elon throws a rock at it and says it's not supposed to, or I guess it was a steel ball, not supposed to break. I mean
Mhm.
that's all Mars stuff, right? And we have to set up power stations and power grids, and then the picks and the shovels after the settlement starts, the things that all the railroad guys made money on, selling that to the miners, right? So that's, I mean, we're sort of back to the future in a way. Going to Mars, it's like repeating history from 500 years all over again.
I guess the saying is true. History repeats itself. Everything is
Sure
cyclical.
does, just on a different scale, right? It takes us
Right.
18 months to get to, well, I guess it's 9 months to get to Mars on a reasonable trajectory. I mean, that's not that much far off sailing from Europe to the New World. I think it was like 3 months back then, 3 or 4
Mhm.
months.
Yeah, and obviously, there's different agencies like NASA, for example, of course, that does their analog missions. But the Mars Society has MDRS, where uh, analog astronauts can go and they're testing their what it's going to be like to live in small confined space with a crew. And so, hey, 9 months. If you could make it 9 months, get to the red planet. I mean, that doesn't seem like so long when you're on that journey to be the first to witness another planet. It would be incredible.
Take a lot of books.
That's right. Hey, well, make sure you take Go. Bring all the rules if I can get it in there.
Shameless plug. Thank you. Thank you.
Honestly, it's been great. I've really enjoyed reading it. I was
Good.
earlier. I was in Florida last week. I was reading it on my flight back, and yeah, check it
Oh,
out for
good.
looking for a
Yeah.
good read.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a movie in the works, so I've had a studio approach me, and yeah, some pretty big names involved. So yeah, we'll see if we can get the deal done.
Oh, that's so exciting. Okay, well, as soon as I see that it comes out, I'm going to be there in line to go see it. Well,
Exactly.
Jim, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so
Passion.
much for connecting and hopping on the podcast and answering a ton of questions and dealing with technical issues. I promise I'm not just saying that is the first time that's ever happened, but we roll with it. So yeah, thank you so much for your flexibility.
My pleasure. And sorry I couldn't get to all the questions. I've been seeing a bunch of really good questions over there.
There's so many. We'd have to do this for another. Maybe we need to do long form Joe Rogan and make it get all the
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, I'm old and tired. Maybe I wouldn't make it.
I probably wouldn't either. But again,
Yeah,
thank you so much for being here. Again, I want to thank everybody
my
that
pleasure.
today that joined the conversation. Thank you to our executive director, James Burke, PR director, Michael Stoltz. Leah, thank you so much, our producer, for hanging in there while we had some technical issues. But again, as you have heard me say before, and it is obviously and apparent from this conversation, the best is yet to come. Thank you,
Yeah,
everybody.
absolutely. All right. Thank you, Ashton.